This is Basket Case Clubs, CPR Group's podcast where we turn basket case clubs into showcase clubs. Joining me now are two of my very favourite people in the world for a very special episode of Basket Case Clubs. I would like to introduce you to my mum and my dad, Suzelie Connelly, who started CPR Group all the way back in 1997, and obviously with the wonderful help of her loving husband and person who could put up with all of our crap. So congratulations, firstly, because CPR Group turns 25 this year.
Thank you.
So welcome to the podcast. This is your first time on.
Indeed. Thank you very much.
Have you had a chance to have a listen? You've me putting you on the spot now.
We did. Back in the early days, basket case cases was our favourite listening material.
Yes, and she still knows how to butter things up, butter me up the right way.
Hi Michael, it's a pleasure to be here, and congratulations to everyone involved on reaching a milestone, a quarter of a century. Incredible.
Thank you. Well, congratulations to you as well for being there right at the beginning. So, apart from there being... we did a lot of things in the early days of CPR Group, and obviously they helped shape what we did. But the question that's been burning in my mind is to say, what in the world made you want to start a business to help clubs that, with us kids, we never even played in the clubs that we started helping first? What in the world made you want to start a business to do that?
Well, it was a bit of a journey, I've got to tell you. So, as you know, for a while I was a local councillor. And while I was in council, I learnt a few things and noticed a few things. And one of the things that I noticed was that if a developer came to council, went to the bureaucrats and wanted to start a major project, they had to have a business case. And the business case had to have benefits for council in it. So the sorts of things that council officers and councillors were looking for were local employment, benefits to the public, maybe some parkland, maybe a boardwalk. So you get the idea that the business case had to be a win-win. So the developer was going to develop maybe a shopping centre, maybe a new suburb, but it had to be something that both benefited the developer and the local public, so the local community. So a lot of the things that I saw along that line were projects that built community capacity. So I thought, well, that's interesting. You know, the developers could just come along and they could say, this is a whiz-gig project, prove that there was a need for it, and walk away happy with an approval. But there was more to it than that. So that was one aspect. The other aspect was that it was quite noticeable, maybe back in those days more than perhaps now, that if a bureaucrat or a councillor was interested in a particular sport, that sport did well. It was the one that got the fields, it got more use of fields if that was at issue, and when there was funding available, very often those sports got the funding. So I guess that taught me two things. So one was, and it made me think, why don't not-for-profits and why don't sports clubs have a business case? Like so often in life, we just drift along and do what seems to be the best thing to do. But unless you actually step back a little bit and look at who you're benefiting, what you're doing for your volunteers, what you're doing for the local community, how you're building capacity, how you're improving young people's lives, really. Unless you do those things, you'll be flailing about a bit. You won't be sure of what you're doing. So I guess, you know, thinking about it after you talked to us about doing this, I thought they're probably two of the things that I took from my experience in council. Then after I was in council, left involuntarily, well, it wasn't my choice.
Those damn constituents. I handed out how to vote cards for you, Mum. I did my bit.
And look, thank you. We really appreciated. I really appreciated that.
For what it's worth, of course. Thank God you didn't get back in, because we wouldn't be here if you did.
Well, that's a Funny thing that you should say that, because that's quite possible.
Yeah.
So then I went to work for a company that was writing business plans, coincidentally, for businesses. And it's a very short step from there to think, if a business needs to plan out, what their growth's going to be and how many employees they're going to have and which widget they're going to produce next year, then perhaps this has wider applicability. Perhaps it would be a good thing to think about planning, just planning, because so few of us do it. So few of us get outside the box and think about, how could we do things differently? How could we do things better? Can we look at what other people are doing and take some lessons from that? So doing those business plans for what were quite small businesses made me realise, I guess, that clubs and organisations and not-for-profits all face the same issues.
So was there a connection then, or an opportunity that opened up that said, here is a club that needs exactly what you've been doing for small business, that was the catalyst for saying, well, I could go and do exactly the same thing over there?
There was a club, and I won't mention their names, and the chap who was running the club, the president of the club at the time, was a friend of ours, and they wanted a grant from the government. So it was a natural progression to say, oh, I could help you with that. And I think it was probably free, just to help him because he was a friend. But in doing so, we realised that there was potential to help other people the same way. So they got the grant, they're still going very strong, and we moved along to other clubs, many of whom were introduced to us by word of mouth.
So all the while, you were in council for, it was a 3-year term at the time?
3 years, yes.
And then how long were you with the other consultancy doing business planning there?
Probably 4 months.
I thought you were going to say 4 years, so 4 months. It seemed like a longer time than it was looking back. But it was 25 years ago, so my memory is very hazy.
You were just a baby, weren't you?
Well, no, I was learning to drink. I was at university learning to play guitar.
Right.
So we've got 3 years of being a councillor. There was a bit of a political
landslide is the word you're looking for.
No, I'm going to the other end of it, when there's the political brand building that you had to do beforehand in becoming a councillor in the first place. So, Dad, over to you. You've sat quietly on the sidelines watching all of this happen. And then at some point, Mum's come to you and said, hey, I've got this idea, and you've helped her set up the business. What did you see at that time?
What I saw having children involved in sport was the importance of sport as an activity to develop individuals. The other thing that became apparent was that land resource for sport is scarce. And to be able to convince an organisation, a government body, that land should go to sport rather than commercial land use for which they'll get rates and make a lot of money, you've got to have a pretty good case. So we've developed this idea of building a case. And it also led to the idea of multidisciplinary sports fields. So we got involved in that. So some of the projects in the early days involved the use of sport fields for football, cricket, tennis, baseball, BMX, all manner of activities. And that was a significant driver in getting into that. So, yes, I moved into the field coming out of an IT background.
Pardon the pun.
And started to apply the principles of that business degree that I had in developing the business. I'm looking at, as Suzelie said, the business cases and making out a really solid case for the development of sporting activities.
Yep. And did you at any point think, surely there's got to be something, after 3 years of council work, and I remember that time, there was no free time, there were no weekends, we'd be literally sitting down to dinner or to brunch on a Sunday morning and the phone would ring and then Mum would be off on the phone to a constituent. That then very rapidly shifted to the fact that volunteers work outside of hours and they're doing their club work. So the cold dinners and the vacant mum's seat at the table, you didn't crack the shits at that too much?
No, in fact, it gave us a bit of an understanding and appreciation of the work that people do in sporting clubs and how the volunteers are the lifeblood of the organisations and what a valuable resource they are, and it gave us some empathy with what they were doing.
So, Mum, you've had a political career, and Dad, you spent time in union politics back in the 70s?
Yes.
Yeah. So you've both had experience in governance, in going to meetings, in policy development, in looking into the future. So did you find that was the sort of stuff that you could bring? Was there a natural progression from what you brought from that experience into the work here as well?
There was an application of what we'd done in the political and industrial sphere to what happens in sporting organisations, yes.
And perhaps the other aspect of it, which we haven't mentioned yet, is the importance of communication. So working in politics, working in business, working with people, whatever the forum might be, it's very easy to mistake people's motives or to get yourself, tied up in making an inference that is incorrect. And unless you keep talking and unless you have mechanisms by which you can do that, so well-run meetings, for example, it's going to fall down.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot that still goes through. So that's enough of the pleasantries. Dad, I know that you've recently been through, to keep the organisation, to be as ambiguous as we can about the organisation, but you've recently been through a winding up of a branch of a larger organisation. How was that experience?
It was a bit of an eye-opener because that organisation had a problem in that it had branches that were not recognised in its constitution. It actually went through an amalgamation, introduced a new constitution, whereas the previous constitution did recognise those branches. That was no longer the case. I was the treasurer of the organisation and felt that there was a risk associated with that because we didn't have the legal backing. I asked some questions about insurance and the like, and wasn't happy that we got a clear decision on it. Nor was there a commitment within the organisation to introduce legislative change. I know that what you and Steve are doing is bolstering the strength of organisations by looking at the constitution, the rules, the bylaws, and helping them with their AGMs. That was enough of a concern for us to have a meeting of the branch and decide to shut it down because the risk was too great.
It's really interesting to hear you say that because we're having a few discussions about this at the moment, given that coming out of COVID there was quite a few organisations that didn't survive and so had to go through a winding up process. But there's also a natural reason sometimes that an organisation will wind up. So that's interesting that it was the potential risk to the individuals who would be involved. And while the law may protect you in limiting your liability to the organisation for satisfying its debts at winding up, there are still fines and it's no fun going to court. So it's interesting. It's personal risk is another reason why an organisation's relevance may come to an end.
Yeah, so worthwhile organisation, worthwhile aims. People can continue in their individual capacity and get protection by the organisation, but as members of a branch which wasn't constituted within a constitution, you're at great risk of ambiguity and being caught out.
Okay. That's nice. Just thank you for indulging me in a little negative detour as well, because obviously the podcast is called Basket Case Club, so it's all well and good to talk about businesses that have been around for 25 years, but it's nice to pepper in some shittiness in that as well as we go through. So back to the business then. As you set the business up, now, Mum, you were saying that earlier that it started with taking the small business mindset in helping small businesses to set a plan for the future. What was your plan for the future 25, 24, 23 years ago?
That's really cruel. I'll tell you what my plan was, and it may seem a little bit out of left field. There used to be, and you will possibly, some of your listeners will have forgotten, that there used to be such a thing as video shops where you could go and hire a video.
Sounds like a blockbuster of an idea, Mum.
Pretty much. So these video shops were still there in 1997, but they were struggling. And I thought, what if I set up a business, just a little business, and go and help some of those video shops build on the strengths that they've got. So what are their strengths as opposed to, say, Netflix, for example? Obviously, you go into a real shop and you get a real product in your hand, which is a video cassette, as it was then, no CDs then.
I had to teach my kids what a rewind button was. What do you mean rewind, Dad? Do you mean skip back?
Very funny. So the way that I saw it was that they could build on their strengths, so they could have wine and cheese nights and movie nights, and they could have groups like a book club where people get together or watch the same movie and then talk about the movie. It was a dumb idea.
Hang on, you mentioned wine and cheese, so you had me there. So watch a movie, which takes a lot less time than reading a book, and then have wine and cheese where you talk about it.
I actually thought it was a brilliant idea, and I sent a very nicely worded letter off to the local video shop offering to do this for them for a very small fee, so to set up the marketing for them to take off and do it. And they would still be in business, wouldn't they, Michael? If they'd only listened to me. But the funny thing was that I put an advertisement in the telephone. Oh, do you remember telephone books?
I do, yes, yes.
Some people won't.
No.
There used to be such a thing. And I put an advertisement in saying, you know, we do anything, no job too small, pretty much. And it got picked up. People found it. I think, too, there was a bit of the fact that people knew us, and so they came to us if they had a problem, and little problems became... No, that's not quite right. I was going to say little problems became bigger. That's not what I meant at all. But where we started helping people with fairly small problems, we then moved on to getting quite major grants for people, for example, and developing programs for sporting clubs. And of course that was about the time that you joined the business, Michael, and got dropped straight in it. And I was late for a meeting, I seem to remember.
Okay, I've been polite. What do you remember about that day?
Not a lot.
It's because you weren't at the meeting.
I don't remember why I was late, but I wasn't not there.
No, you were just at another meeting. You were coming from another meeting that was held up. So it was a Tuesday afternoon. The skies were a little bit dark as a storm rolled in from the ocean. It was a meeting at a surf club, hence why I remember the storm rolling in over the ocean. And I don't think the storm ever broke, but it was the dark skies and the misty look around the place.
Ominous.
Okay. Well, and now that you say that word, yes, it was ominous, because here's me thinking, oh, she'll be here, she'll be here, she'll be here, she'll be here, she'll be here. And so then all of the people who were going to the meeting that we had called, I think we were doing some planning with this club.
We were.
Still going from strength to strength.
Mm-hmm.
And they invited me in and we sat down, and there's only so long that they can offer you a glass of water, and I can politely refuse a cup of coffee because it's too late in the afternoon for me and I don't want to have to go run off for a wee halfway through the meeting. And then one of them, politely banged the table, two hands, said, right, so, Michael, what are we here for? And that was it. I seem to remember, hence why I remember it probably better, because I was in the meeting. And then eventually you arrived. But that was probably not a bad thing. Like, have you looked back on it since then, dropping me what felt to me in the deep end?
Yes, in the deep end. Well, they say that's how kids learn to swim, and you certainly learned how to swim.
Well, because otherwise you hit the bottom. You don't breathe anymore.
But Michael, when he hit the table and said, right, what are we here for, Michael? I bet you winged it.
I probably had enough of an idea of what we were there for, because we'd been working with the other organisation, and so we'd been doing all of the big business planning work, and I remember a lot of matrices and tables of risks and benefits, and so it all made sense. And then I think we were doing some grant work for these guys as well.
We were.
So then obviously I had lots of questions and things that I didn't know about that we were going to have to put in a grant application, so it naturally flowed. But it was probably one of the only times I've ever really had to struggle in a meeting, because ever since then it's been, well, this is why we're here. You've got problems. So that was one of the other things that I've been thinking about. When you were interested in transitioning from the work in business to the work in clubs, were there pain points that you saw that they had? So apart from the fact that, as we know, sport is business, and so sports clubs should be treated as businesses, including having consultancy support as well as businesses. But did you see other pain points that you knew, well, this is one of those little problems that we can help solve?
Probably the one that springs to mind when you put it like that is volunteers. So a business has employees, and the employees can choose to stay or go. If they're not getting enough money, sayonara. With volunteers, it's a very different dynamic, isn't it? You need your volunteers, and in a lot of ways, the volunteers need the organisation. So they want to be part of something. In many cases, they want to help their kids play sport, and they don't want the organisation to fold. So that relationship is different from the relationship of an employer-employee, and yet there are some crossovers there as well, because you have to give as well. It may not be monetary, in fact it's not monetary, but you must make sure that you give appreciation and gratitude, understanding to your people, and give them the tools that they need to do the job. And I think that's where you and Steve have probably made big strides, because when a board or a committee takes on board the sorts of things that you guide them towards in terms of their volunteers and how to treat their volunteers, and you've got a lot of background now to the sorts of things that volunteers want by asking people and listening to what they've said about it. And that pain point can be terrible. It can lead to the demise of a club. If a president is overworked, throws up his or her hands and says, I'm out of here, that club can die overnight. So part of your job is to make sure that that does not happen, to make sure that that person doesn't burn out, doesn't feel unappreciated, and understands the importance of their role, because that too is very satisfying. We all want to feel needed.
Is it at all disheartening to know that in 25 years, what you've just said is still 100% accurate?
Oh, gee. I thought we did a better job than that, Michael.
It's a big world. So in Australia, we estimate that Fair Trading is telling us that there's 23,500 currently incorporated associations in Queensland. So if you extrapolate out, there might be 100,000 in the country. It might be more. So there's a lot. Plus, everyone who is here today, there's a chance that they weren't here on, the 31st of August 2021, a year ago. There's a chance that everybody's new. So everybody brings the passion and the interest. So to use your staffing analogy, they bring the passion and the interest, those most important attributes that you hire for, but they don't bring the skills or the experience. So they don't have a backlog of experience that is how to deal with volunteers, that is different from how to deal with staff. So the transience of committees means that we will always have a job. I would love it if we didn't have a job to do.
Yes.
But because of that transience, we have to keep going. But the thing that I've made a bit of a point about is we have to come to peace with that. So we have to keep going. Yeah, okay, you need to get to the end of the Harbour Bridge and then go back and start painting from the start again. Come to peace with that. The world is going to keep changing. There are structural changes that I believe that we can make, and I think I remember talking to you about it. We were standing over there in the doorway of your house, and I said, I reckon in 50 years, we're halfway there, we will transition from volunteer-only organisations through to a more, what I called at the time, a professionalised model of sports delivery in the not-for-profit sector. We'll still have not unpaid boards. We might have honoraria, we might have stipends, we might recognise out-of-pocket expenses.
Yep.
But the delivery of sport probably needs to step up and look at what's happened. Of the $13 billion that goes around the Australian economy in sport every year, only a tiny fraction of that is going to our not-for-profit clubs. The rest of it's going to the CrossFits and the gyms and the commercial, the indoor netball and the indoor cricket. and they're charging enough to make good businesses out of their activities.
Okay. Yep.
So we just need to keep that push, and we're seeing it happen. We've seen it happen in netball. You don't have unpaid netball umpires anymore. You don't have unpaid football referees anymore. So we're seeing that transition. We're having people, the expectations that us parents of individual sports have, that there's no way that I want my son coached by the dad who's just left standing when everyone else takes a step back when they say, would the person who'd like to be the head coach take a step forward? That's not how individual sports work. Golf's not like that. Tennis is not like that. Swimming's not like that. Athletics is not like that. Gymnastics is not like that. You know, some of the equestrian's not like that. Some of the really expensive sports. So we are on that journey. So yeah, it's fascinating that you say that, but we've come to peace with it, which is kind of why we're still doing what we do.
What became apparent to us in the early days working with sporting organisations was the great value that some volunteers provided. What was also apparent was that some people were dysfunctional for the organisation. Being independent, arm's length, objective, we were able to look at that and help the club work through getting rid of some of the people who were dysfunctional. Another factor was the multi-sport disciplines that we talked about, conflicts between the appropriate use of the premises for change rooms, for sporting facilities.
It's really funny, I just have to interrupt because it's exactly one of the other things that we still see as massive cause of conflict.
Well, it is, and the beauty of the services that CPR Group provides is to assist organisations at that objective level to understand their strengths and their weaknesses, to bolster their strengths, to minimise their weaknesses, and to become more aware of the organisation as it relates to other bodies that are using the fields. The other interesting change was to move towards peak bodies of organisations and start to implement at a national or a state level the policies, practices that were best suited to that sport. And that ranged across a whole range of sports. And that's been a great benefit to the organisations because they themselves would not necessarily have implemented best practice, but by approaching it from a national organisation level, you do what's best for all the clubs.
Yeah. So there's something else that I want to reflect on now. As obviously you both know, so Steve and I are two of 6 kids, and I don't know of many other families, possibly in the world, that get 6 out of 6 when it comes to nerds. There is something that makes us all particularly nerdy, and as we've said on the podcast many times, you know, there aren't too many people that when they're going to a meeting, and meetings make people get, I don't want to go to a meeting. So we're on our way to a meeting, and that meeting is about a constitution, and we're so excited. Steve, the girls know when Steve's going to a constitution meeting because he's got this spring in his step, and he skips down the corridor. So we've all got our things. Simon's into his big trains, Anthony's into numbers, Michelle's into her theatre, Vinny's into his politics as well. We get into things and we just get right into it. Now, we were just having dinner before and Dad shared a story with me that made me understand why we're all nerds. So now, post-CPR Group career, Mum has just started studying psychology. It makes perfect sense, you know, really all we do is work. It's not about organisations, it's not about parks, it's about the people who activate these spaces. It's about the people who have to run these organisations. So the more you can understand what makes a person tick, the better you are to communicate with them, to be able to connect with them, to be able to have the right sort of conversation that inspires them, to find that little spark of motivation to be a volunteer that already exists inside them and fan it into a burning flame for themselves. So that's why I don't think it's a big leap from where we are to psychology. But Mum's just finished her statistics module of the psychology degree that she's doing, and she just winced for everyone. This is not a video. Now, for most people who study psychology, when you get to that bit about statistics, it's the bit where everyone loses a bit of hair and a lot of sleep. But Dad's been absolutely loving it. Mum just let me know that Dad found a book of statistics, the book that he read in 1960-something, for fun. So I think you enjoyed that, Dad. Would that be right?
Loved it, yes.
And I enjoyed having a very erudite tutor.
And for anyone listening who may be marking Mum's assignments, he was only a tutor. He didn't do any of the work for her.
Oh, no. No.
So yes, that's why we're nerds. Where are you a nerd, Mum?
Oh, I have no idea. Maybe biology. I really loved biology. So my first degree, as you know, was biological science. And there's just something, for example, in the behaviour of animals that's really fascinating. So you get a rat and you put him in a maze and you teach him that if he turns right, he will get a reward because that's where the food is, and you block the smell off so that he doesn't know where it is. Then you take the rat and you put him at the other end of the maze, and guess what?
He turns right?
Yes. Yep. Because he's made a cognitive map of the maze. Because you let him roam freely, then you put food and reinforce that there's food there. So yes, those sorts of things I really enjoy, and just thinking about what you can learn from that. So you get back up at a higher level and you think about where in the brain does that come from? How does it express itself? How does he make his little legs run along and turn in the right direction? Because what's memory? How does he remember it? So one little experiment like that can tell us so much, but it also opens up a whole lot more questions.
But there's also the fact that when you watch a whole bunch of kids like us playing soccer as little kids, we look like rats in mazes getting lost bumping into walls the whole way around.
But no food.
No food. Well, there was the oranges at half-time and the watermelon at full-time. So, looking back over 25 years of CPR Group, this is a question that I want you to both answer. So you can think about it first, and if you get the same answer, that'll be interesting. What are you most proud of for CPR Group being 25 this year?
Now, this will seem funny, but I think it's probably the thing that I'm most proud of, and that is that some of our children followed us into the business and excelled at it so much that we were able quite confidently to turn our backs on it and say, you do it now. Over to you. Michael, I need you to go to a meeting.
I'll be right there, I promise.
The organisation also changed over those 25 years. It had challenges through economic downturns, through COVID and through changes in legislation. We've worked in a variety of different fields within development, extractive industry, as well as sport, recreation, not-for-profits. And the organisation was able to be flexible and maintain growth through all those 25 years, never went backwards. So I think that's a great credit to all involved in the organisation and the organisations that we worked with to make those adaptations and keep the business running and still be there 25 years later, providing a great service to organisations and helping them bolster the sporting industry as a great outlet for kids within the country.
And one thing that I must just add, because it would be very remiss and also wrong not to do so, and that is all the people that we've worked with. So both the people externally, but also the people internally, so the members of our own staff who've come with us and enjoyed the ride.
And I hope that they still do.
Yes.
So this next question then is, I have to preface it because I'm going to ask you to look back and think, knowing now what we know about the industries in which we do and have worked, is there anything that you would do differently? But I want you to think about it not from, oh, well, if I had my time again, I'd just go back and buy $10,000 worth of shares in Apple and now I'd be worth squillions, and maybe let Steve Jobs know of this thing called an iPhone. Just take just 1%, Steve, that's all I need. So apart from knowing the lotto numbers and being able to go back and tell yourself those, knowing the way that, so Dad, you talked about the changes in legislation and the changes in funding policies that have been in government, is there anything that you think that we could have done differently And I'm asking this because now we are in the past of the future. So should we be changing direction now as well?
I think one of the things that really characterised CPR Group was that we were very nimble. We had a lot of different lines of business. So constitutions, helping councils with leasing policies, the new apps that you're developing. These things show a sort of, not footloose, but nimble would be the word that I would use, I think. Nimble and flexible. And I think if I was going to give somebody advice about starting up a business and saying, you still want it to be running in 25 years, I would say, look outside the box, look around you, plan, but you can only plan, like none of us can crystal ball, but do the best you can. Think about what might happen, but also make sure that you're reasonably diverse. And I think that all of us have got a range of skills which can be applied in different ways. And I think that, as much as anything, has been successful.
Talking about nimbility and flexibility, yes, not only were there all of the things that you mentioned, but I remember Dad helping get a suburb renaming across the line.
Yes.
At one point, the breadth of the things that we've done. Shopping centres, quarry expansions, buildings, resorts, the redevelopment of hills.
I suppose the key thing is to be flexible, to look always beyond the boundaries, not only look ahead but look sideways as well, and say what else is coming in that could hit us out of left field or right field, and that applies to our clients as well. Be alert on their behalf to what challenges they might face. And I can't think of anything that we would have done differently, because having that open outlook means that you're always looking at the horizons in front of you and beside you to see what's ahead. The focus being forward like that means that you're not getting caught out. So I think that flexibility still applies.
I suppose it's an interesting balance as well, because an important part of a successful business, and whether it's a business that is developing residential property, whether it's a business that's digging quarry product out of the ground, whether it's a sports club that is helping young kids find their feet and then excel, or to be a big community club, or to be an elite level club, it's about knowing your purpose and niching down on that purpose. But within that, so Mum, to go back to what you were saying about the being nimble and being able to take on what it is, then there's within your purpose having the flexibility to be able to do a range of different things in a way that is valuable at the time, but then also sustainable.
An example is the focus that sometimes applies within sporting organisations on seeking funding. That funding is only as good as the policies of the government of today. If they decide, as they have done in the past, to discontinue certain funding for major projects, minor projects, if that's all you're doing and you're an organisation that's dependent on that, your business will dry up overnight. So the club will fail. So you have to be prepared to take a professional approach to the way you run the organisation, and that's what we're seeing our organisations do. They're becoming far more professional, less dependent on handouts, less dependent on legislation. They become proactive.
And running good businesses in their own right.
Yes, doing a wonderful job.
So what do you think, or what do you hope, maybe, for the future of our little enterprise here in helping mums and dads who are running sports clubs and people who are beginning their careers in sport with a council or with a peak body? What do you hope that we can do as a business for helping all of those people who are putting their heart and soul and their blood and their sweat and their tears into sport in Australia?
Give them some structure. So give them the underpinning that they need, which in many cases is so simple. In many cases it's as simple as, how do you run a good meeting? How do you stop a meeting getting out of control so that everybody goes home with their head in their hands because everybody hates a scene? How do you do that? So if you can teach enough people how to do those, in some cases, very basic things and do them well, then that's probably my hope for the future. So yes, get them to manage their assets properly, get them to run meetings properly, help them to do those things, then our work here is done.
But will we need to keep doing it when those people change?
Of course we will. Of course we will.
Of course, the upside is they take it to the next organisation where they go.
But not only that, I think if you've done a good job, the next president will be briefed by the previous president. The structures, which is what I really meant, those underpinnings will be in place. They'll have good note-taking procedures, good minuting procedures, so that everybody knows what was decided at a meeting and what they have to go and do. Such simple things. They are such simple things, and so hard for people who have their own families to run and their own businesses to run, to focus on doing for their club, for their association. So if you can help them do that, go and do it.
We will do our best.
There will also be opportunities like the Olympics coming up, so clubs need to be aware of where the opportunities exist for their particular sport and to capitalise on that and plan, implement what's best for all the participants, the elite athletes and also all the others who will benefit from the sporting infrastructure that will be introduced into the country.
Well, thank you very much for your time, for starters, but more importantly, thanks for a nice job.
I'm glad you're still enjoying it, Michael. We certainly always did.
Yeah,
always.
It's hard not to. It's hard not to. Working with family was always good fun. We probably put in a few too many late nights, but I don't know whether that's because we were really engrossed in the work or engrossed in the company.
Or inefficient.
Well, thinking about some of the things we'd changed, probably not so many of those all-nighters. Anyway, look, it's wonderful to have started with a good team that was all Connollys, and now, as Steve calls them, we've got lots of Nonnellys as well. There's only a couple of Connolly. Well, no, there's, 4 of us who still have Connolly. So, yeah, it's great fun. So thank you. And most importantly, congratulations on getting us to this point, getting us to a point where you can now sail off into the sunset or drive off going to the stable where there's the 2 ponies, the red Ferrari on one side and the red Mustang on the other, and drive off into the sunset.
All the best for the future for you and all the clubs you're working with.
Thank you.
And congratulations on where you've taken the business too.
Oh, we're loving it.
Good. Thank you, Michael.
My pleasure. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That is Suzelie and Peter Connelly, the founders of CPR Group 25 years ago. It has been a great journey. We've had lots of fun travelling on this trip together. And if you're not already doing so, make sure you follow us on social media. You can visit us at our website, cprgroup.com.au, where you can sign up for our newsletter. And of course, a big thanks to Jess, as always, for doing our editing and being our wonderful producer. And until next time, make sure you enjoy all of that basket casey goodness, and we'll see you then.